Good evening. We're a panel discussion on Vermont's mountains in the context of industrial wind development, and we're here under the auspices of Peak Keepers, an organization that advocates for and educates about Vermont's mountains. We are not denying the reality of climate change or that it is a crucially important issue that must be faced, but we are deeply concerned about the impact of large-scale wind development on Vermont's fragile mountaintops. My name is Tom Slayton. I'm a journalist, but the panel members here are all earth scientists, and I would like to introduce them, starting with the person on my right, Steve Young, who is founder of Center for Northern Studies and a leading authority on the ecology of the North. Next to her is Susan Morse, a wildlife ecologist, a internationally known teacher and habitat specialist. And Charles Johnson, who is a former state naturalist and an author. And Will Amidon, who is, like myself, a native Vermonter and a geology professor at Middlebury College. And so to get us started, Sue, the format we're going to follow is each of our panel members will have a 5-minute chance to speak, to present information that they wish to present, and then we will open it up and have a general discussion. So, Susan, what specific impacts do you see occurring on mountaintops and high ridgelines as a result of wind tower development and increased human presence there?
I am very concerned about the sudden proliferation of these and proposed proliferation of these facilities, primarily because of the intrusions that they will introduce into habitats that really haven't seen a lot of human activity. The occasional hiker, the occasional backcountry skier, the occasional hunter, birder, but certainly not an industrial footprint on these higher elevations. And I don't want to restrict this to just the highest ridgelines in Vermont. I think even the lower hills that overlook our towns and villages are at risk too, and they too are, if you will, a last stand habitat for the wildlife that live in some of these places. Certainly the roads that will be introduced into these facilities will be devastating. They will cause what we call habitat fragmentation. Not that mountains will be made into islands as a result of a linear road, but the phenomenon today is generally recognized that any road and all of the things that roads introduce cause fragmenting influences, which are most often negative for the wildlife that live there. Our ridgelines serve as preferred travel routes and movement corridors for many species of wildlife: black bear, moose, bobcat, and even some of our endangered species, including American marten and Canada lynx, for example. And these facilities on the ridgelines, with their noise and with the human uses that will accompany them along the roads, will certainly have a negative impact on the foraging strategies of these animals, their sense of comfort as they move along the ridgelines and seek out mates and seek to disperse along these ridgelines. And I just want to conclude by saying that our mountains are, if you close your eyes and picture Vermont's wilder terrain, our mountains are our core habitats, and they are relatively unfragmented habitats in which our wildlife are able to thrive and reproduce and hopefully in which our wildlife and plants will be able to adjust to the terrible impacts of climate change that we know are going to happen. So scientists all over the world today are arguing that we need to conserve core habitats and connective habitats to keep the fabric of life healthy.
Thanks. Steve Young, a generation ago, the environmental community was solidly behind Hub Vogelmann's proposal that development above 2,500 feet should be severely limited. Most agreed that the line should be drawn at 2,000 feet. Above that level, there's little historic disturbance, and the soils were more fragile, thin, and poor, and access was difficult. Why has this changed?
Well, I think that's a very good question because I don't think it has changed. I think that the reasons for setting that limit at 2,000 feet, or officially it was 2,500 feet, but I think, as you say, almost everybody agreed that 2,000 was a much more appropriate figure. I think the reasons were good then, and the reasons are good now. I think the underlying thing is this, that above somewhere in the vicinity of 2,000 feet, it's no longer feasible to farm. It's very difficult to get up in there to log. Generally speaking, the tree species are less desirable and they don't grow as well. So there hasn't been the logging pressure. So when it comes right down to it, well, of course, in addition, particularly the ridgetops we're talking about here today, haven't been subject even to, they're not high enough for ski areas. They don't have the long trail running through them. So those that stretch of subalpine region, which is really our only or our main example of a boreal forest subalpine region in the state, is also our most undisturbed and pristine countryside. And so it was a good idea a generation ago, and it still is, to keep this undisturbed, and for many of the reasons that Susan was talking about, these are kind of our reservoir for many of our animal species, and as well as some of the plants.
And that restriction was written into Act 250 many years ago, but more recently we've seen high altitude development encouraged with placement of industrial wind towers on places like the Lowell Range and Sheffield Heights. Those are closer to the 2,000 foot elevation that you mentioned. And I wonder why we're seeing this attitudinal change towards this very sensitive area. Anybody care to take a crack at that one?
Well, sure. What we've got here is a situation in which it's kind of a wedge issue. You have a very clear recognition in the environmental community that global change is for real, it's happening, we're seeing it, and we should be doing anything we reasonably can to avoid exacerbating it and hopefully even to some degree diminishing it. At the same time, you have these areas which we want very badly to protect, and so you get these two conflicting, or at least on the surface conflicting things. And at the moment, there's this, I think the tendency is to consider the global warming thing as being, it's kind of in the ascendancy at the moment.
Thank you, Steve. Will, could you discuss some of the hydrological implications of siting wind pads on ridgelines?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Tom. So in general, one of the concerns with global warming is that we could see more violent storm events, more precipitation in a shorter amount of time that would then cause rivers to peak more quickly, resulting in more violent and damaging flood events. So one of the goals of mitigating global warming is to mitigate these flood events. However, if you try to do that through placing or developing wind turbines on ridge lines, you counteract that effect a little bit, basically by taking what would be very permeable forest soils and also just permeable forest floor, where there's a lot of leaf litter, twigs, other things that slow down runoff and give water time to be absorbed into the soil. And so when you take away that littered forest floor and soil from the tops of these ridge lines, what you see is much more rapid runoff. The water flows immediately off these ridge lines into watersheds, and you lose that buffer, basically. The water goes more quickly into the watersheds, rivers peak higher, they peak faster, they peak more violently. And I would just, to illustrate this effect, what you can picture is replacing forest floor with some very impermeable both gravel roads, also concrete pads, which are going to be 50 to 100 plus meters in dimension. and may significantly affect the hydrologic balance coming off these ridge lines. So I think there's a bit of irony here that in order to protect ourselves against floods, we're actually taking away the very natural buffers that already protect us from them. So.
Great. Charles Johnson, let me ask you, what are you feeling and thinking deep down when you see new industrial scale, 400-foot tall wind turbines going up on Vermont's ridgelines?
Yeah, this comes out of a context of working on protecting mountains and ridgelines for 30 years in my career as state naturalist. And just so happened the other day I was traveling up near Lowell, and I saw for the first time, I saw the towers. And the very next day I happened to be over near Georgia and saw the towers going up there. And my immediate reaction was this terrible sadness, sort of a sadness in my core, I guess you could say. Looking back over 30 years, it seems like the proliferation of towers seems to have happened overnight. Where is the end? There's no plan for a build out. That occurred to me. When will this all end? And it was a reinforcement of this impression I've had of the incremental loss of Vermont's sort of emblem over time. The Green Mountains, which are on our license plates, are different. The turbines, again, an impression I had was that the turbines have become, or are becoming, a new emblem, a new symbol of what we value most in our society, which is the need for energy. And it's replacing that earthbound symbol of the mountains in their wildness. The final thought I had was, what is wrong with our system that has allowed this to happen to such a degree, so rapidly, without really regard for people who are protesting? And it led me to believe, look at our land use laws, our Act 250, which even Act 250 and the land use laws regard land as a commodity for our use. They call it even natural resources, which the phrase inherently says they are resources for our use. I kept wondering, where was the hole? Where does the land begin to speak? And the mountains have sacrificed for years, for generations for us. My final thought was, when do we start sacrificing for them?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, I'll chime in here as a journalist and a person who has hiked the mountains my entire life, and who has been editor of a magazine that promotes Vermont. And I would say that Vermont's mountains are part of the signature of our state, and therefore there is not only a spiritual connection and an aesthetic connection that we have and should have to the mountains, but there's also an economic connection. And we have to wonder what will happen if large industrial scale towers taller than the Bennington Monument are placed on mountains throughout our least developed regions. What effect this will have on tourism. We don't know, but I think it does make you wonder. That is from the perspective of journalists. So to go back to the perspective of a scientist, I'll ask Susan Morse, do you have concerns about the ill effects of wind turbine noise on wildlife?
Yes, I do, and while I've not been author to these papers, I have read extensively in the literature and learned that there is a considerable outcry of concern from scientists who are looking at the degree to which this chronic noise, as they call it, causes animals to change their foraging behaviors, to avoid the infrastructure to avoid abandon their nests in some cases. In other cases, more subtle but no less dangerous, is that the noise certainly can ill affect a predator's ability to detect and successfully find prey. Similarly, it can certainly influence a prey animal's ability to detect and avoid predation. And certainly the calling that animals do to find mates and to establish territories, all these things are impacted by noise. One study I was intrigued to read found that even the recruitment of tree seedlings of a given species, this study was done out in New Mexico, pinon pine, it was found that the change in the distribution and abundance of small mammals that historically distributed the seeds of that tree species and allowed it to reproduce, it changed all that, and that tree species recruitment patterns declined. There's just a tremendous amount we don't know. I mean, I've just rattled off a few things we do, but in all appropriate humility, picking up on what Charles has said, it's time for us to make a sacrifice. It's time for us to, we've been really good at excusing ourselves for hundreds of years as we ravage nature, but at what point will we love nature?
My questions now are more or less for the entire panel, and just feel free to jump in as you see fit. But we know there's an alternative energy siting commission that's been set up to study wind siting and other alternative energy sources. But I wonder if we feel that is an impartial group, and what provisions are being made for impartial observers and impartial scientists to gather information on long-term environmental, economic, and social effects and the overall viability of industrial wind projects in Vermont.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that one of the interesting concerns here is just how much transparency there is in this whole process. And I'm not sure that I'm in a position to comment on it very specifically. Lack of transparency is something that's very hard to discover. But I think that a point that I think will come through over and over again here in the next few minutes is that if you're going to make an honest evaluation of this sort of thing, an evaluation based on hard science, you have to have access to being able to make scientific studies. So, for example, one of the things we know is that north-south ridge lines are very important for migrating raptors. This is true all over New England and down through Pennsylvania. It works because the prevailing winds come from the west, and so you tend to have a rising air along the ridge lines. And so in many days you can stand on one of these ridge lines and watch literally hundreds of hawks coming down through. Now, if you're going to put large towers with 150-mile-an-hour rotors going in the middle of one of these migratory pathways, it's potentially very dangerous. Now, we don't really know how dangerous it is. And the way to find out is to go, and since we already have some of these things in place, whether we like it or not, the way to find out is to go and make a serious, careful study of exactly what is happening there. I honestly don't know what provisions have been made for this. I'm very concerned about it, but you can't have this happening by having employees of the corporation, for example, going out and seeing how many dead birds they can find. What you have to do is have a scientific inquiry based on unbiased people coming in from outside and making a carefully designed study. So this is the sort of thing that has to happen for us to be able to evaluate whether these things are in any way worth the cost that we're paying. And I use that as just one example of many different potential costs, most of which we're incapable at this point of evaluating until we can get a better scientific handle on it.
So that raises the question of the fact that wind power development seems to be proceeding despite the need for more scientific information. I wonder if each of the panel would respond and give us a sense of how you feel about the need for a moratorium on wind power development in the face of the current situation.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mentioned earlier the pace of development, of ridgeline development is quite staggering. And as I also mentioned, there's no end in sight, and people need to know what's the build out. Also, and I heard just yesterday people using the word NIMBY, that anyone who's opposed to industrial wind, not in my backyard. Well, I happen to think that my backyard is the place I love the most. Therefore, I will do the most to protect it. And I think it's perfectly normal for people to feel that way. And NIMBY shouldn't be a term that we use derogatorily. With that in mind, I think that since these towers are impacting not just the immediate site, but the whole state, you can see them from miles and miles away, there needs to be more than just the town in which they're located that has a say in this. Outlying regions need it. We have to have all these scientific considerations as well. So the moratorium, I think, would really help give us time to really get these studies in place and have the proper voices heard.
Yeah, Sue?
I mean, in all honesty, I'm not opposed to wind per se, and I certainly am deeply concerned about global climate change and ways in which we need to immediately act to limit its effects as best we can. But I see this wind tower development and other similar energy production and/or extraction projects all over the United States as the gold rush of our times. I see industrialists seizing this opportunity under the guise of green energy and energy independence to get this stuff all over our remaining core habitats. And I see that as a very, very dangerous and destructive thing.
So would you favor a moratorium or?
Absolutely, but not on the assumption that we might find it is permissible somewhere. I would say, I mean, at some point we need to draw the line in the sand, and I would say that core habitat shall not be intruded into, period. Worldwide, I don't care if you're in the Amazon or the Arctic, core habitat on planet Earth is the last stand for life as we know it to adjust to the damages we've caused.
Could you give us a quick one-sentence definition of core habitat?
Larger unfragmented blocks of habitat in which many species can thrive and persist over time and adapt and show some resiliency, if you will, in the face of the damages that we've caused.
And we have a fair amount of that in Vermont at present, do we?
We do. A lot of it is concentrated, of course, along our ridgelines, which is why none of this should happen.
Charles, I'm going to bounce that one back to you as a former state naturalist and ask you if you feel that there is core habitat and whether or not it's threatened.
Yes, in my last sort of few years of working with the Agency of Natural Resources on these issues, one of the priorities we worked on was making sure that there was connection between big blocks of forest land. The fragmentation due to development, roads, population increases was severe and coming. So we acted or tried to act to preserve these large tracts of land, to maintain north-south connections when it was still affordable, in effect, and looking ahead, not reacting, but looking ahead. And I think a lot of the work that was done then was very important. A lot of it was focused on bear habitat. Now it's been expanded to more indicator wildlife, a much broader umbrella. But still, the effect is the same to maintain this, and the need is still there. It's still crucial.
Will, would you like to respond to the idea of a moratorium? Do you favor that idea or not?
Yeah, I mean, I might jump even all the way back to your question about the Wind Siting Commission and whether or not they're impartial. I think they probably are impartial, honestly, and I think they are probably hearing a range of voices. In fact, I know they are. Whether or not I support a moratorium or they will support a moratorium, I think the most important thing that they should recognize and that we all support is more local control. And if you look at the current situation, what you see is wind generation falling under the auspices of Section 248 rather than Section 250. And the reason for that is nominally so that the Public Service Board can control a steady supply of electricity, stability in the grid system, which neither of which are important here, neither of which apply to new wind development. There's no stability issue, there's no supply issue. The real issue is an Act 250 issue. This is about local communities deciding for themselves what kind of economic development they think is consistent with their community. And so I think what should happen, moratorium or not, is you should put the decision back in the hands of the community, subject it to Act 250 so that communities can make these decisions for themselves. I would also add a key difference between these two processes is that the 248 process, there's no local stakeholders. So basically the very people who are being affected are not automatically granted a seat at the table, unlike Act 250. And so I could see the Siting Commission hopefully recommending something like that, that at the very least the 248 process should include local select boards, if not other community members. So
Yes, jump in there.
If I can add to that, I've been hired as an expert witness involving a wind energy facility in New Hampshire, and my impression of the whole process now that it's over is it was enormously difficult and expensive for the citizens who tried to insert themselves into that process and affect their own communities positively with their voices. And it's just not fair. I've probably said that 50 times a day. It is not fair.
However, we know that in Lowell, in the Lowell wind installation, there was a local vote, and the people in the town of Lowell voted fairly strongly to have the wind installation on top of Lowell Mountain. What's your reaction to that? Steve, you live up that way.
Yeah, I live up that way. In fact, I live 2 towns away. I live in Wolcott. And Wolcott, of course, was not even considered. Wolcott is not, Craftsbury, which is an adjoining town, was at least allowed some say in this. Almost any highland you stand in Wolcott, you can see these towers. And almost any time in the night, you can see a festoon of red lights all the way across Lowell. Now, this doesn't affect us. We're too far away, and we're never considered. There are, in the surrounding towns of Wolcott, at least 3 or 4 other ridges, any one of which is probably developable in the same way. And generally speaking, we don't know about what's going to happen until the process is already pretty well started. Now, since none of these, at least in theory, are actually within Wolcott, we probably have, if the process goes the same way it did in Lowell, we probably have no say whatsoever. And yet there will probably not be a single place on any hilltop or any higher level farm in Wolcott when you won't be able to see this line of blinking red lights in areas which we used to consider our best possible view, let's say.
Yeah. And so what has happened is that you have an impact, but you have no representation. Yes, Susan.
There's a whole new science now, which we appear to be ignoring in our process of trying to measure the impacts on things, and that's called cumulative effects assessment. And the idea there is that any single human-caused effect may seem by itself benign and harmless, but collectively over space and time, we're finding that these things are very dangerous for wildlife, and just in terms of their bioenergetics and their flight response, their continual having to invest energy in getting away from what they perceive to be dangerous to them. I just have to boil it down to the animals. What do they think of all this? Where do they get to go? Do they get a ticket and move somewhere else, or, you know? And the idea is that we're going to mitigate for this. We're going to give you this piece of land to take the place of that. Well, that's giving me a bushel of apples to take the place of a bushel of oranges. It's not fair.
Tom, if I could jump in. and sort of come back to my sort of original observation, which was there was something missing in the process. And that, for me, that missing is look at the whole. What does this land mean? Not for its component parts, not for how we can use it for any number of reasons, not how we review it under 8 criteria of Act 250, with the end result that it gets developed in a different way. But what does the land mean to us as a whole? And I think what's been missing is a recognition that people love the land. And how do you quantify something like love? And how do you quantify that relationship that we've had from children to the land that sustains us? I use this, have come up with an analogy of a Beethoven symphony, that how can you dissect a symphony? You can't say it's just woodwinds, it's not brass, it's not strings, it's not percussion, it's not the conductor, it's all of that. And the magic that comes in the music is in that synergy of all of it together. It's a holistic thing that we love. Just as a person that we love is not a sum of all the parts. It's an integral whole. So I think that's the kind of discussion that I think has been missing all through, when we try to add up the reasons that we can develop something.
And you've made a point in other discussions that you and I have had about love of the land. Vermonters have traditionally been very close to the land because they got their living from it.
They worked it.
And when they went hunting, they went to the ridge tops, and when they went fishing, they went to the mountain streams.
Right.
And so I think there's a historical connection between Vermonters and the natural world, and if we do it simply on a certificate of public good under Act 248, we're missing something.
Absolutely, and I was thinking back on my career that, yes, part of it was to teach people about birds and plants and rocks, but the bigger part was to get people back to nature and to sort of rekindle that association that may have been lost. It's not, nature just isn't the sum of all those parts.
Yeah.
And I would just jump in and build on what you guys are saying, as far as if you look at the impacts of wind, it goes right to the core of this natural world we live in. And it attacks the least developed spaces that we have, really the heart of this system that these guys are talking about. You compare that with other energy sources like perhaps solar or other centralized generation, and solar can go happily in our most developed places. The rooftop in an urban area, a farm field that's been cultivated for 200 years. So as far as a holistic kind of meshing or synthesis with the system, wind is about as bad as it gets, and you can argue that some of these other energy sources are going to be much more compatible with preserving what we love about nature.
Let me ask you to expand on that a little bit, Will, and tell us, is Vermont a good place for wind generation in general terms, or not so good?
It is not so good, and I think that a lot of people miss this in the rush to make a contribution. Everyone's concerned about global warming, and we all want to do what we can as fast as we can, as we should. So you hear that wind generation will offset CO2 emissions other places, which is actually true if you follow it back far enough. What you don't hear is really how little wind generation potential Vermont has, and that if you compare the amount of electricity we can make from wind in Vermont to the amount you could make in other states, like Kansas, for example, it really amounts to unfortunately, a negligible amount of electricity and a negligible CO2 reduction comparatively.
Vermont.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if the producer could switch to this slide that we have here, which shows a wind map of the United States. And I love this map. I show it to my class because it really illustrates the situation we're in. If you look at this map, the purples are the optimal wind generation sites, mean wind speeds greater than about 9 meters per second. If you come down the color bar all the way to about brown, about 6.5, that's the lowest end of land that's potentially useful for industrial wind generation. So you look at the map of the US, where are the reds and purples? They're all in the Midwest. They're all in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, basically, where these cold, dense winds come ripping off the Rockies. The wind blows all the time in these places, mostly agrarian or ranch lands, very flat, ideal land. Nothing is displaced by building wind turbines, relatively little ecosystem impact, wonderful yield because of these high winds coming off the Rockies. So that's where, as a nation, we should be focusing our wind development efforts. If you contrast that to Vermont, you all know where it is up in the corner there, and we can zoom in on it here, hopefully still looking at these slides. Vermont, we don't even get into the purple range. We get only into the lowest quality wind generation lands that exist at all. And those lowest quality lands on a nationwide sense are in our most precious core of our natural environment. So you look at the reds and oranges coming right down the spine of the Green Mountains. This isn't a joke. These are places we know as the top of Mount Mansfield, the top of Camel's Hump, the top of Mount Abe, and then a number of other lesser summits that Sue mentioned earlier. So I think it's an important thing that we're really trying to squeeze blood out of a stone, for lack of a better word, trying to make wind energy in Vermont. And the price we pay to get a very small amount of electricity is huge in terms of damaging these fragile ecosystems that these guys have talked about.
How does the footprint per megawatt of wind compare to the footprint of megawatt per solar or some other alternative source?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's a lot of things that go into thinking about it. If you look at where wind is going to go in Vermont, it's going to go in strings of turbines that are along ridge lines, okay? These aren't grids or fields like you'd have in the Midwest. This is 300 or 500 meter increments marching down your favorite ridge line. Assuming that we're not going to put these things on top of Mount Mansfield in the best absolute spots, they're going to go in the kind of mid-elevation range, the kind of 2,000 to 3,000 typically. And that's going to cut way, way down on the amount of electricity you can make at those mid-range elevations. Bottom line, for those places, you're looking at about one wind turbine equals about 0.3 kilometers square of solar panels. So a healthy farm field of solar panels. But I would just emphasize again, although that sounds like a lot of solar panels, they don't have to go in the same place. They can be on your rooftop, they can be covering your parking lot, and they feed right into the existing electrical grid. Okay, these are going to be put in places that already are connected to the electrical grid. Whereas wind, we're going to have to blaze new, quite destructive power line swaths to reach these isolated mountaintops. So the trade-off isn't just about square footage, it's about which land is potentially usable for these energies.
And I'll ask you, and I'll ask the rest of the panel to respond also. Is there any potential at all for instead of huge wind towers on top of mountains, on top of ridge lines, is there any potential at all in Vermont for a Vermont scale alternative energy solution that involves smaller wind, maybe some low head hydro, a lot of solar, and a great deal of conservation?
Yeah.
I think those are the areas that some of you know more about than I do. I've always wondered, ever since this issue has come up, I've wondered if we couldn't do a Vermont scale alternative energy and thereby reach some of our goals. I'd love to have you respond to that.
I'll just put in my favorite very quickly is methane digesters. Down in Addison County, everyone's loving the methane digesters.
Because you have a lot of dairy cattle over there.
Yep. The
right.
farmers are in favor. They're making extra profits on burning methane that was going to go right back into the atmosphere anyway. We're making homegrown electricity. So that's one example. Probably you guys want to pick up on others.
Well, I'd love to pitch a thought in on the conservation idea. I, with all due respect to Vermont's energy plan and Vermont energy efficiency efforts and the people working on them, I really feel that I'd love to see the tremendous public investment that we're all making, instead of being put into the hands of industrialists putting wind towers on mountains. I'd love to see it come to Vermonters, each and every one of us, to really work on making our homes more energy efficient, to work on improving the way we get around. I mean, that's the biggest consumptor of energy in Vermont, and the biggest contributor to global climate change is the cars we drive and the oil we burn. So to me, that's the imperative we need to really deal with.
Mm-hmm. What happens if, in fact, the windmills on top of our mountaintops don't work as well as they have been touted as working? If they produce less power, if they stand idle a long time, if they have increased wear and tear. There was a wind turbine on top of Grandpa's Knob back in the 40s or 50s, I think. Anyway, many years ago, and it blew over in a windstorm. What happens if these towers are become obsolete and inoperative? Where do we go then? What happens? Do we have a decommissioning plan, I guess is what I'm asking.
We don't have a commissioning plan. I don't think we have a decommissioning plan.
There you
go. My gut feeling is that not too far in the future, wind towers may well be obsolete with new technology, new ways of producing energy, saving energy, which always seems to get back seat. It struck me when I was coming back from Europe recently how many lights the cities have that are on, which incidentally attract birds and kill thousands and millions of birds. What happens if we just turn off the lights in the cities? In Europe, the transportation systems are just wonderful, and they're full. You pay
the mass transit
systems of train, buses, metros, whatnot. Those are social commitments that can be made. But what's happening now is we're blasting the tops of mountains off for a short-term gain, long-term destruction, and the mountains will never be the same. But the towers may well be gone in the future. So what happens then? So yes, I think we need to do some hard thinking, hard planning, and hard carrying out of plans that we haven't done.
And I think I would just pick up on that quickly. You often hear people say wind is attractive as a fixed cost energy source. So basically you build it and then you don't have to put any more money into it. And it's not clear that that's true. A whole generation of gearboxes in Vestas turbines are starting to fail all around the country. Replacement is in the millions of dollars. So there is wear and tear on these things, and they don't have infinite lifespans. I guess the other thing I would say, and just picking up on what you said, is everybody wants to make a difference in the global warming battle, and absolutely the biggest bang for the buck is in the conservation. And that's where 90+% of our CO2 emissions come from transportation and home heating. And so everyone's in a huge rush to put turbines on ridgelines without necessarily looking, not even in their backyard, in their basement, about how they could actually cut CO2 much more radically right in your own home. And I would also add that if you look at the jobs that are created by doing that, maybe you hire a contractor who's your neighbor, right? And you go shop at your local hardware store. You rush to build wind turbines because you think you're reducing CO2. You are basically filling the pockets of out-of-state investors, often international investors, who have no interest in Vermont, and there's nothing local about it. So it's a little off topic, but
not at all, not at all.
Well, plus the energy footprint of just making these things and getting them shipped from Spain or China to Vermont and down the highway and on and on. I mean, I don't know that we're fully calculating that cost.
Yeah, and there is the issue of essentially industrializing the least developed parts of the state. The Northeast Kingdom, there are places now where you can see nearly 50 wind towers, and there are dozens more proposed. And it seems to me a terrible shame that the least developed, most rural and attractive parts of our state, the states that are most like the Vermont I grew up in, are being selected by the marketplace, not by any particular plan, as a place to put these wind towers.
Tom, if I
Yeah,
could
jump right
interrupt. In the last decade or 20 years, one of the big movements in this state and in the country has been, eat local. Grow local, eat local, buy local. Why not get energy local? Because there's some great forces at play against that concept. But I think if we put our minds to it, and we have the ingenuity, we have the willpower, we could make that movement just as strong as the others.
Yeah, I think this is something that we really need to emphasize very strongly. I think part of the problem is that it's hard to figure out ways to make a lot of money doing that. The money is likely to come in a sort of dispersed fashion.
Right.
And it's pretty good for the local electrician and not so good for we won't name names. But when you start thinking about the possibilities, you talk about how important transportation is in terms of producing CO2, and can you imagine a technology that would allow you to hook your little solar panel on your roof to your rechargeable car, and maybe you don't run your car entirely on that, but maybe you cut down by 20 or 30 or 40%, and you do that in any kind of a reasonable scale, and you're going to offset a whole batch of, you're going to offset all the wind turbines that are ever going to be proposed here. And this is the sort of thing that we need to be looking at all along, I think, is increasing what I think of as being gentle technologies as opposed to harsh technologies. And you can't get a better example of a harsh technology than chopping off the tops of mountains in order to put wind towers there. And those, basically, the only thing that will ever change those mountaintops again is another ice age. You have to glaciate them to get rid of those pads.
If that.
Let me ask each of the panelists what you think is Vermont's responsibility in alleviating global warming. Sue, do you want to take a crack at that? Do we have a responsibility to help alleviate global warming?
Everybody does, and we're no exception, but I think we need to look to ourselves for fundamental ways that we're going to change and we're going to get better. And that's why nature's so important, because the plants, the animals, the rocks themselves, the summits, they can teach us how to be human.
And
the ultimate sense of the word.
And an intact ecosystem is a counteraction to global planet change.
Yeah, I think we do have a responsibility, but I think it's that which we're capable of doing and can lead by example. And example is not to destroy the very basis of your existence. And we can do these things that Steve was just talking about. We can do the local. We can be inventive. We can conserve. We can protect our very base of operations and not sacrifice that. So the leadership and the example setting has to be appropriate to where we live and who we are. We can't be setting an example for the whole world. We have to do it for the way we are.
And Vermont is different. We know that.
Vermont's different.
Yeah.
Will.
Yeah, I just echo your sentiments. We don't have an opportunity to make a huge dent so we all care about global warming very much. As someone who teaches climate classes, it's terrifying to see how fast things are warming, and in our lifetime it will be 1 degree warmer. So there's no doubt this is a very pressing issue. The question is, how do you draw out the costs and benefits of each action you take to stem the tide of global warming? And I think this whole conversation here is arguing that industrial wind development in Vermont gives very, very little benefit for a very, very high cost, a very high impact on our landscape and our lives. So I'll leave it there.
Well, let me ask the panel again, take this on a different way. Big wind, huge industrial scale wind towers on mountaintops is an issue faced off against global climate change that has divided the environmental community, not only in Vermont, but region-wide and probably nationally, but it's divided the environmental community. Do you folks see any way that we can heal that rift, that we can bring the environmentalists back together again as a united force?
I would hope that, you know, with time, now that a few of these facilities are established, that we would have a chance to really measure the ill effects of these things. And I would hope that the citizens listening to us today would help us. I think a lot of Vermonters have been tricked by all this, and an awful lot of people have heard from a few environmentalists that are pro-wind and a few politicians, and so it's all a good thing, and this is what we need to do. But there's another whole side to the story out there, and we really hope today, that's why we're all here, that the people will do their homework and join us, join with our peak keepers effort and get the word out, because I do see that there's going to be a mounting resistance to this, and with good reason. And hopefully we can stop it before too much more damage is done.
Yeah, I think as in all relationships, talking and listening, simple as it sounds, really make a difference, and keeping dialogues open. I see the fight now between environmentalists as strong as it was 30 years ago between developers and environmentalists, and we've come a long way in that regard too. I mean, we don't, as long as we don't vilify one another, as long as we do listen and try to talk, have a conversation, not a talking at, I think we can come back together over the larger issues. Yes.
Well, I think that this goes right back to the early part of this discussion. I think a really important part of this, of course, is having good information, which I think we all agree upon. I think that the information, when it is developed, if it is developed in an unbiased and fair sense, is probably going to show that there are some very serious concerns about wind power, and that to go back again to your question of a moratorium, that at the very least a moratorium is I would call it absolutely essential, but certainly justified and likely to continue to be justified by all the information we're likely to develop. I think another thing, a couple of other things that's come to me. One of them is, it's interesting that this group here, which is largely scientists, have tended to come down very strongly on what I guess I'd call spiritual issues, aesthetic issues, and I think this is altogether appropriate. This is, scientists are people, and this is what scientists do and should do. But it's heartening that it comes up in this group. But I think your point is really well taken, Charles. That we've gotten into the wrong way of dealing with each other on this. What we've gotten is becomes more like a court of law in which you have two sides trying to browbeat the other, or to in some fashion or other trick the other into taking or into showing where the other side is wrong. And in some cases the other side probably is wrong, but nonetheless we need to approach it with the idea that we are indeed people of goodwill, and that there are very long-term needs and hopefully solutions here. And if we can't talk to each other in some sort of a fashion other than essentially fighting in a court of law, then there's not much hope for us.
Exactly, and I think if you go back to a sort of the most basic level, all of us, whether we believe in industrial wind power or not, are coming from a place of love of the earth, and that we're trying to do the best we can with the tools we have and the kind of souls we have to honor that. And it has to be based on mutual respect ultimately.
And that really sounds like a Vermont approach to it to me.
Yeah.
You know, and a closer and more intimate way of looking at divisions between us. Will?
I just echo everything you guys have said. We all have the same end goal of reducing CO2 emissions, and just picking up on what you just said about the tools we have, and one of my hopes as a scientist is that the tools we have are always changing, and that the picture we see now, the solutions we think are possible now are often based on the last 10 or 15 years of tools, not based on the next 10 or 15 years of tools. And one solution I see is slowing things down. You know, what's the rush? Let's take this process slowly. May well be that in 5 years we have new tools like biofuels or improved solar efficiency that are going to change the whole conversation and actually put us all right back on the same page. So that's one piece that I see is always.
Let's not make decisions now that are irrevocable or very, very, very long term at best, when there might be something coming along technologically that would help.
I hope so. And you know, another thing that always comes up at this point is this quote that was in the 2004 governor's report on wind energy, which was basically, it's very hard to say whether you're in favor of wind or not without knowing what the ultimate scope of it is going to be. And I think people like the folks we have at this table are concerned that the scope is going to blow up in our face, and many of these ridgelines are going to be lost to wind. And so I think that's a really important question, possibly about bringing the two sides of the issue together, is where do you draw the line? How much electricity exactly do you need to make from wind, if any, and where's the line? So.
This is a very divisive issue, and I think everybody at this table feels, as I do, the pain of the realization that, as Michael Soule has said about environmentalists, is that we've circled the wagons and we're shooting inwards, and it's awkward and it's counterproductive. But really, I think Charles's points, all of our points, is that this is a social thing. This is in us. We've got to make sacrifices, and we've got to love the world that we live in, and we've got to make some hard choices, but not to destroy our mountains. That's just unthinkable to me.
Well, in the very short period of time that we have left, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to just say 2 or 3 sentences, a little bit about what mountains mean to you in their natural and trammeled state. Will, do you want to start us off?
Sure.
You've lived here
to me,
pretty much all your life.
These mountains are all about places you can explore, and you know, nothing thrills me more than driving up to the crest of the Green Mountains, getting out of my car, walking off into the woods, and knowing that when I get to the top of the mountain, I'm going to look down the other side into an empty forested catchment, and that sense of wild spaces and that sense of excitement connecting with these mountains, a very sacred place for me, and that's one of the reasons I care so much about this issue.
Charles?
Yeah, very similar. You know, it's metaphorically we look up to the mountains, and what's the biblical expression? I raise my eyes unto the mountains. They're inspirational. They're where we get a lot of our sort of reason for being, in a way. And you know, it was always sort of metaphorically appropriate also that the mountains were looking down on me, because putting me in my place. And with turbines on top, it's a different relationship. Yes. So it's a very heartfelt thing.
Sue?
I'm powerfully moved by my plant and animal neighbors and the rocks and soils and waters that make their lives possible. And the mountains really are embodied by all of them, the bears and bobcats and fishers, and who knows what the possible new members of our mammal community and bird community may be on our mountains. And we just need to leave them in place so that can happen.
And Steve?
I like your comment about exploring. I spent a lot of my life exploring in very strange places, and some of the best and most pleasant exploring has been done right in my own backyard. and you never know what you're going to find, but you're probably not going to find it on a large pad of crushed rock. So I think I'd like to just, my final comment for myself would be, let's not give up hope. The world is going to change, but the world has done a lot of changing in the last 1 million or 2 or 5 million years, and it's going to do some changing now, maybe a little bit faster or quite a lot faster than we wish it would. But the changes in climate are probably something we can deal with. The changes, if we are destroying habitat, are things that will be very difficult to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say from my perspective, as someone who's walked in the mountains and enjoyed the mountains of Vermont for more than 60 years, they are places of beauty and complexity, and I would hate to lose any of that complexity. You can find it on top of Mount Mansfield, the highest mountain in the state, or you can find it on the more modest mountains in our own backyards. I think particularly of a time in the spring, and I like to go to the long trail south of Appalachian Gap. And if you time your hike right, you're going up to top of Stark Mountain, hobblebush will be in blossom. Mm-hmm. And hobblebush is this wonderful plant that has big white complex flowers that towards the end of May it just pushes out towards the edges of the trail, and you can climb through these blossoms and hike down through them, and it gives you a sense of what spring in the mountains really means. I don't think you're going to have that same feeling walking along the top of the Lowell Mountains these days. It's a totally different feeling. And the feeling of being in nature, of communicating with nature on a nonverbal basis is part of what makes us Vermonters. And I think that's an important part of why we're all concerned about what's happening on the ridge tops of the state, and why we're active in connection with peak keepers, in trying to take a deep breath and look again.